Take me back to the sequence of that night.
It was a Friday night, and traditionally in John's family, Friday nights, his grandfather, old Italian grandfather, would do this big meal and everyone would come on Friday night. And so we arrived there, but we were late because we had been to a wake. One of his uncles was coming out of the house and he said, Katie wanted to go to her friend's house, stay overnight. Is it okay? I brought her up there. And we're like, yeah, no problem, no big deal.
I remember having Katie come over for a sleepover, and we got into our two-door Honda Civic, and my mom was driving the car. Katie was in the rear seat behind my mom in the driver's seat, and I was in the front passenger seat. We were on our way up to Warwick Mall on Route 4, and we were in the middle lane of travel, and all of a sudden I remember being thrusted forward in our seats and then quickly going back into our seats. And I had my seatbelt on, and our car just started to gain speed, and it got faster and faster and faster. And I remember our car veering into the median and then going down the grassy median and then coming back up the embankment. It all happened so fast. And then I remember seeing cars coming straight at us, and I remember out of the corner of my eye seeing my mother trying to veer our car back out of the way of oncoming traffic and into the grassy median. And that's when I lost consciousness.
So when I called, Becky's brother, Robbie, who was a junior in high school at the time, answered the phone, and I told him, it was Katie's mom, and could I speak with her? And then there was this long pause, and I kind of waited, and then someone's voice got on the phone, and he identified himself as a state trooper and told me that they would be right over.
The next thing I remember after losing consciousness was I remember having my eyes closed, but I could still see and make out flashing lights all around me, red and blue flickers. And then I remember opening up my eyes and seeing the night sky. And I remember thinking, what just happened? And all of a sudden I remember feeling my body start to roll. And that's when I realized I was on a stretcher. And there was a paramedic near me and an EMT. And all of a sudden I saw the roof of the ambulance go over my head. And I saw the doors shut to the back of the ambulance. And that's when I realized something really, really bad had happened.
The doorbell rang and I saw the car drive up, and John went out to meet the troopers on the front step.
What I remember is Mrs. DeKubelis coming out on the porch, and I think she had a phone in her hand or something in her hand. And when she saw us pull up, she dropped the phone.
Todd and I walked in. As we were walking in, we confirmed that Katie had been killed in an accident.
And they said, "I'm sorry, sir, to have to tell you, but Katie was killed this evening."
Sheer madness, oh my God, this can't be right. It's you literally cannot be telling me that my child has just been killed in a drunk driving crash.
She fell to the floor in grief, and Mr. DeKubelis tried to console her at the same time, as we tried as well.
So I immediately said, what about Marsha? What about Becky? Are they okay? And he said, Mrs. Bowman was also killed, but Becky is on her way to the hospital, and we're hopeful that she's going to be okay.
I was sent to the side room of the ER, and that's when I first saw my dad and my older brother, Rob. And they came running into the room. My dad came over and held my hand, and the nurse was sewing up my ear. And as she was done sewing up my ear, the nurse left, and my dad was holding my hand, and my brother was in the corner of the room. And I remember looking at my dad and saying, "Dad, no one has told me yet, is Mom and Katie all right?" And that's when my older brother lost it, and he slid to the floor of the corner of the room and he started crying, and my dad was holding my hand and he squeezed it. And he said, "Mom and Katie didn't make it." And I'll never forget that moment.
The DeCublises went in to view Katie and to positively identify her as their daughter.
Katie was lying on a gurney across the room. She was covered up to her neck with a sheet. She had one tube protruding from her mouth. And we walked over and she barely had a scratch on her. I remember her hair was in a ponytail, and I placed my hand on her head, and her ponytail was still damp from where she had taken a shower before she went over to the Bowmans.
I know in the Bowman case, the nurse reminded me after we left the room and Mr. Bowman had made that positive identification, she reminded me to take the ring off of Mrs. Bowman's hand, that it might be good to give it to him now so that it didn't get lost or he forget about it. And he came back in and he took her wedding ring off her hand. I'll never forget that.
I was in shock. I was in the car with them an hour ago, and we were gonna go to the Warwick Mall, and we were gonna have a good time and spend our gift certificates that we got at the mall, and we were gonna have a sleepover that night. And now my life just completely changed forever.
It was the same hospital where I had delivered Katie. And these flashbacks of being at the hospital. Sorry. Being at the hospital that I had delivered her at, and now I'm at the hospital to go and identify her body at 13 years old, and none of it made any sense. I remember not wanting to leave the ER. I think I was afraid that if I left the ER, I had to leave her there. And it was so unnatural for a mother and a father to leave their child at this point, because you're not supposed to say goodbye to your child at 13.
Why'd this have to happen to me? Why'd my mom have to die? Why did Katie have to die? Two amazing people. And why did I survive? And they didn't. And I was very upset. I was angry with God. I was just lost.
If it had not been for the fact that we were so blessed to have two other children, then things might have turned out so differently. In a sense, they saved us, because if we didn't have that purpose and that need to get out of bed in the morning, then we may have crawled into some hole and not been able to do that, and not been able to function.
You know, we've had a lot of different things we've seen on this job, a lot of horrible things, but that case, for what it was probably the worst one I've ever dealt with.
Certainly, it was the worst shift I've ever worked on the state police, for me personally.
You know, I remember at her wake, we're getting ready to go to the funeral, the day of the funeral, and a mother and a little boy came to the funeral home. And we didn't know who they were, so we went to introduce ourselves. And the mom said that her son, who was younger, but was in the same school with Katie, had special needs, and that he was often bullied and a lot of people would make fun of him. And she said that Katie went out of her way to make him feel comfortable and at home, and reach out to him every day to see how he was doing. And so much to the point that this little boy felt a need to come and say goodbye to her. And her mother said he wouldn't take no for an answer. So that was the kind of person she was with everybody.
It says I've pushed the drunk driver out of my life, and as a person, I, within myself, forgave him for what he did, and by doing that, it freed me from holding all that anger and allowed me to move on with my life and enjoy life and enjoy every day of my life and remember my mom and Katie with every breath I take, but not be so angry and upset all the time.
We'd like to think that from Katie and Marsha's deaths that the positive part has come where you know, people have heard our message. When we've been out there speaking, when our foundations, you know, had certain projects, and they've been involved, and we hope that the positive ripple effect of that would be that people learn, that they learn from it.
I dream of her often. I feel like she's with us a lot, and it's very interesting to now have a grandchild and see in her parts of Katie, and yeah, she still does come back, which is a really good thing.
My mom was an incredible lady. She just was funny and kind and loving, the best mom in the entire world. And she was an amazing cook. And she was always supporting my brother and I with whatever extracurricular activity we were doing, whether it was cheering for me on the side of a soccer game, more than I would have liked at times, whether she was behind stage at a ballet recital I was in, helping with hair and makeup. She was always involved with my brother and myself and worked a lot to provide for us. And I just love her and miss her so much.